Hello again, everyone. I am recording this lecture on Sunday night. It's the 17th, and I'm recording this right after I've graded everyone's week 3 discussion board. So I did want to talk briefly about that. Um, I'm actually very pleased with the quality of everyone's posts, not just uh, the initial post that everyone had to these questions here, but also to the discussion that you had with each other. Um, I noticed an increase in grades. I noticed uh, just the general amount of information that was covered and some excellent points that I saw brought up. But I did want to clarify a few things for those of you who might have questions about your grades. I know I do take off points, for instance, on initial posts to these questions that I have here, uh, based on whether or not you answered the question correctly. And as some of you pointed out, there's obviously multiple answers, I should say, to these questions, but there are some answers that are clearly way off topic because it means that you didn't understand the question. So, for instance, number one was asking about structure. So, structure here means the plot, and a lot of you referenced the Freytag's pyramid, and that's exactly what I was asking, and hoping you guys would comment on. But some of you didn't really focus on that. Instead, you kind of gave me um, basically uh, a repeat of number two, which was a comparison of the two stories uh, to a traditional short story. And then some of you didn't even uh, understand what a traditional short story was. And I think it's possible that you may not have seen the lecture that I had asked you to view ahead of time. But I did talk about what a traditional short story was, especially in terms of plot and structure, because I know some people had claimed something about that a traditional short story has an happy ending or it has a hero, and that's not true at all. Um, that's not how we define traditional short stories or how we define genres, for that matter. Um, Number two, there are plenty of good answers that I saw for this one. A lot of you had interesting things to say. You didn't just focus on structure; you guys focused on content as well, and I really enjoyed that. I did see a few answers here though that were very, very basic, things that are so obvious that they really don't bear mentioning. And then for number three, again, commentary I think was generally good. I think most of you hit on some good points. One I especially liked was the kind of morbid idea that both stories are about the inevitability of death and mortality, which is pretty close to accurate. That is generally what both stories share, but they actually had more interesting commentaries about just the way we conduct ourselves, and I think some of you were hitting uh, a chord with that idea as well. So again, that's just the basic ideas, and then of course when I um, grade your discussion with each other, that also depends really on just the quality of your content. For some, I still see some people, only agreeing, meaning that they didn't say much else except for, I really agree with this point. You made an interesting point. I never thought about it that way. You had a really good response overall. If that's all you said in a post, then I didn't count it towards your grade. I just didn't consider it while I was grading. I only looked at posts that had more than that. Sure, you could have agreed or you could have liked what someone else had to say, but then you added to it. Either they brought up an interesting point. For instance, if you had said, "Hey, I'd never thought of it this way," um, and this is why not, and this is something that you can explore later, and you can try to come up with a better answer than simply just saying, "Never thought about it. Thanks for bringing that up." You have to go further, ask questions, try to have preliminary answers for the questions that you ask. So if you do ask a question, follow it up with your own answer, what you think you would answer if you were forced to answer your own question. Okay, but again, generally, I think most people did much better with this round of discussion board, and I hope that you guys have learned from it. I certainly think that most of you figured it out. I gave very, very, very few zeros or 50s this round. People who receive 50s either received them because they only posted the first response to the 3 questions, and that was it. It's also possible, I did have a couple of students who posted the first one, but it was posted late. So I only considered their responses, and the responses were very good, so that earns them a 50, right? At least they did the responses technically. And then, I did have those who did both. They did the initial response and then did the replies to everyone, but the replies were mostly I agrees and I like, or you have a good point, that sort of thing. And that means, of course, if I'm considering the first response, and it's still just a 50. A lot of the people I gave zeros to, again, didn't do anything. Didn't submit even the first post, and I suspect a lot of these students have either already dropped. I haven't checked assist since last week, so it's possible that some of these students already dropped. But I am seeing, again, generally really great responses from you, and just keep doing what you're doing. And if you still see a drop in your grade and you're not happy with the grade you have, feel free to email me, and we can talk about specifically what you can improve. And I'd be happy to use the online office hours link here on the left, so that we can meet over sort of like the virtual classroom, so that we can talk in person. Okay, today's lecture is going to be about the literary analysis that's coming up. So let me go to the course materials section. We're going to see week 4. And in week 4, you'll notice that I've already given instructions about the analysis. You can find the instructions for it here, and you can even see this little guide that I have on what a literary analysis is. I'm not going to go over all of that in this lecture. So first, some important things to note. There are 2 due dates for your literary analysis. The first is a rough draft, and the second is the final draft. You'll notice when you come down to week 4, there are 2 links for submission. One is for the rough draft, one is for the final draft. Now, you'll notice that when you submit the rough draft, after you submit the rough draft, there will be a grade that I assign to it, along with a rubric that'll be filled out. It'll have essentially just the basic breakdown of how I would have graded your paper, but that grade means nothing. Okay? The grade that I assign to your rough draft will have no bearing whatsoever on your overall grade. It will not affect your grade in the class at all. I only am giving these a grade so that you know, if you had turned it in as is, as the final draft, that would have been the grade you received. So it's just something to consider, and I think this is an easy way of determining, hey, whether you need to really beef up your writing or beef up your analysis, or whether you're on the right path and there's just very little that needs to be improved on. So that's something to consider, and that's really what this rough draft here is for. That's going to be due Wednesday. That's in a few days. And then Sunday is when the final draft is due, and that should give you, at least half a week to improve your analysis. All right, so now let's actually get into the analysis. So you can just click on this, and it should open up a link. I already have everything I need here open, so let me go over this again. Again, these are the instructions. I've noticed the deadlines here. And there's a little bit of the objective and the rationale. I'm not going to go over those. Those essentially are just department policies that I have to have when I give assignments. But here are the main instructions. You will be required to choose one short story from the following options. Essentially any of the 3 that we've just recently read, not including the lottery. You're not going to be able to use a lottery for your analysis, because I already covered it in lecture. So you do still have a choice of happy endings, bullet in the brain, as well as what you should have been reading more recently, A Good Man is Hard to Find. Now, I haven't had, or I suppose you haven't had a chance yet to post to the discussion board for A Good Man is Hard to Find. That's due Wednesday. At least the initial response is due Wednesday. But you should have already read it by now. And if you haven't, I really insist that you begin doing that so that you have another choice to do your analysis on besides Happy Endings and Bullet in the Brain. Now, understandably, I think most of you will probably lean towards Happy Endings or Bullet in the Brain because they're relatively short stories. A Good Man is Hard to Find is what we consider normal short story length. It's about, close to 2,000 words, and that's closer to short story length. So it is pretty long, but it is an excellent story. Actually, my favorite of these three. But it is, for obvious reasons, the most difficult to tackle. So it's a challenge, but it's certainly within your reach to analyze it. So you should have picked your option early enough so that you can write your analysis on it and have read the story several times. That's obvious. Even the discussion board requires that you read a few times. In fact, I read some of your posts that said that you read it at least 3 or 4 times and you still had some difficulty with with some of the content. So I admire those of you who are taking this very seriously and reading multiple times. That's good. Now, I, of course, am recommending that you do more than one draft. I'm not requiring, but I'm insisting that you submit a rough draft, and then, of course, the final draft. But if you'd like to, you should visit the Writing Center. And I know that many of you, of course, are online students, so there's no guarantee you actually live near Edinburgh or Brownsville, where the 2 writing centers are. But even so, they do have online services available to you. And if you'd like more information on that, feel free to email me. I can share with you a link to both of their online services. They have Skype tutoring, and they also have a asynchronous tutoring option, which is more like you send your assignment to them and they give you feedback. But that does take a couple of days, so that there's no guarantee that you'll get your paper back if you wait till the last minute to submit it. So always check their website. You can get all the information there. You can even call them during normal hours. I think 8 to 5-ish, Monday through Wednesday, and they should be able to give you all that information. Of course, you need to use proper MLA documentation. So we haven't had a chance to talk about MLA, and in fact, based on what I've seen on discussion board, many of you still don't have a good grasp of it. Several of you have used it with in-text citation, or when you use the parentheses and the page number, that is MLA format. But as far as how it shows up in the works cited page, that I have yet to see. I'm still not convinced that you have a handle on that yet, so I recommend, again, visiting the Writing Center. They can help you with MLA documentation. They won't do it for you, but they can guide you and give you resources so that you can do it on your own. I also recommend OWL Purdue. It's OWL Purdue. That's the online writing lab at Purdue University. They have an excellent MLA formatting style guide page. Besides that, one of the things I haven't yet had a chance to look at for many of you is whether or not you are going to adhere to good grammar and usage conventions. I'm very lenient when it comes to that on discussion board, because discussion board is really just a place for you to share your ideas, to share your thoughts about our readings, and to take them to take them seriously and read through them critically. But if I'm a huge stickler for grammar and usage on discussion board, it tends to rub students the wrong way, and they become discouraged and really intimidated. Unfortunately, I can't be as lenient on the more serious documents because they weigh so much towards your final grade, and in some ways, this is also a showing of your education. Presumably, you should have taken 6 hours of English to take this class, meaning you should have had some experience already with learning and using writing conventions. So if you're still struggling with that, again, the Writing Center would be a great resource for you to learn about the rules and knowing how to use them and execute them properly. Okay, now as far as the actual assignment is concerned, you should make sure that you follow these word ranges. It should be between 900 and 12 words. If you're only writing 900 words, the very minimum, I certainly hope you have a lot to say in those 900 words. Because that's really the short end, and that means you're probably overlooking certain aspects. And I'll get more into what a literary analysis is and why I think certain aspects would be missing if you're only going to 900. If you're going over 1200, that means that certain things probably need to be cut down. Either you're being too wordy, some of your sentences may be redundant, and of course I'm not accusing anybody. I haven't read anybody's analysis yet. Obviously, no one's turned anything in. But that does seem to be my experience. That's just what I've learned from students. So this range, I'm giving you guys this range because if it's less than 900, it means you probably haven't fleshed that idea out enough. And if it's over 1200, it means you're too wordy and you need to cut down. The rest is basically just MLA format, double spaced, Times New Roman 12-point font. Make sure to use in-text citation as necessary anytime you are quoting or paraphrasing material. Make sure, of course, that you use several body paragraphs. Make sure you have a separate concluding paragraph, and so on. The way you organize your essay is really up to you. There is no set structure. But I do expect everything to be, adhering to basic writing or essay rules, like having a thesis, making sure that you support that argument, how well you use literary terminology and elements, and you should be getting plenty of that. In fact, one of the documents I'm going to be going over in a bit is that literary terms glossary. You should be using that so you can start getting a handle on the words that you should be using frequently in this class and that you're going to be hearing from me during these lectures. How well you use examples from the text to support your thesis, but that can also backfire. So one of the things I always see students do is that they'll riddle their essays with quotes from the text. That is not a good idea. If you are relying too much on quotes to do the work for you, then perhaps there really is no analysis. My suggestion is that you should write your own analysis first. Okay, write your analysis from scratch. And then, and only then, after you've written your entire analysis, then go back and add quotes where you think you need to support your argument. The other thing I should warn you is that you should be writing your own analysis, okay? I know some people already on discussion board have been citing websites that they visited, some of which have been analyses of the works that we're looking at. That's also not a good idea, because then you're stepping very dangerously into plagiarism areas, and that's not what you want. You want to avoid plagiarism as much as possible. It can be very tempting to look at these websites for the analysis, but frankly, these websites have very basic analyses. They're not very deep, they're not very thoughtful, and they use very different kinds of analyses. They are not looking at, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the semester, formalism or new criticism. Often they're looking at social historical context. They're looking at Marxist or feminist criticism, which is completely different from what I'm asking you to do. Most of the kind of analysis I'm looking at is formalist, meaning you should be looking at the elements of the story, looking at plot, looking at characters, looking at themes, looking at symbolism. And I'm going to go over some of those things again in this lecture. So avoid sites that have analyses of these works. If you are tempted to go on these sites, chances are you have not understood the story well enough, or you're trying to take the cheap route and not have to read the story yourself to answer this. And I promise you that will not work out well for you. It'll be quite obvious that you didn't read, and your grade will reflect that. And so this is a warning to you right now that if you are tempted to use that, I suggest you reread the stories, as I've suggested many times in my lectures, to tackle this assignment on your own. I'm also going to be looking at how accurately you follow MLA conventions for in-text citations and for your works cited bibliography. Again, you can look at the Writing Center or OWL Purdue for more help on that. I'm also looking at how well you organize your essay, how well you follow conventions of grammar, mechanics, and sentence structure. Basically what I would call American edited English or standard American writing. So, make sure you know the rules for commas, make sure you know the rules for colons, semicolons, periods, that sort of thing, when to capitalize. Another big one, when to put a title in italics or when to put it in quotation marks. I'll just tell you now that if the work is big, and by big, I'm going to say a book. So, for instance, the book that you have for this class, Literature Portable Anthology, that title, because it belongs to a whole book, would be italicized. But any story or chapter within that book would be in quotation marks. So the smaller documents, the smaller literary texts go in quotation marks. That would mean short stories, poetry, novellas, that sort of thing. A larger piece of work, like a novel or a film or a play, would be italicized. Okay. So I'm going to be looking at all of those things, and frankly, it's not going to count so much against you if you mess up the italics or if you don't do the quotation marks correctly. I understand there doesn't really seem to be that big a difference whether you do it one way or the other, but you'll notice you won't get a perfect 100, right? I will only give 100 to a student who, of course, not just expresses their ideas and their analysis clearly, effectively, in an academic tone, an appropriately academic tone, but who also adheres to the conventions well. Okay, I cannot give a A+ to someone who doesn't have the basic writing rules down. Okay. And of course, you can find these submission links in the week 4. I was thinking about putting the week 5, but really everything you need is in the week 4 folder. Okay. Now that we've covered your assignment, let's talk about what a literary analysis is. And again, you can find that link here at the bottom of week 4. I'm going to open it here. So I've actually taken a lot of my notes here from 2 sources. The first source is actually a book called The Norton Field Guide to Writing. And it has an excellent section on a literary analysis. And I have different books that define literary analysis a little differently, but I love the way they did it. They did a simple job. They included some excellent bullet points that I think could be touched on. So I really want to cover that here. So that was one source. The other source is actually a colleague of mine who produced essentially all this at the bottom, who all the way from starting from here. All this down comes from a colleague of mine. The rest up comes from the Norton Field Guide. Okay, so what is a literary analysis? Well, it's an essay that examines a text, a literary text, to understand its message, to interpret its meaning, or to appreciate its techniques or understand its historical and social contexts. We're not going to do so much of the last one. If this were an advanced graduate course or even an undergraduate course in literature, we might, but because this is an introductory course, we're only going to be looking at really these things. And that's understanding the message, trying to interpret the meaning of the story or poetry or play, and appreciating the techniques that they're using. In this case, we call those literary devices. Okay. Now, obviously, there are some few things that you need to have in any literary analysis. And that's firstly a thesis, a workable, arguable thesis. One of my professors and now colleagues used to call a thesis tenable. And I love that word. Basically, whether it can be argued or not. So if a thesis is untenable, then it would basically throw the entire essay off, because the argument on which it is based is baseless. So keep in mind that you need to have a thesis statement. Well, what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is an argument. It is not a fact. So if I say, for instance, the Eiffel Tower is located in Paris, France, that is not a thesis. It's not an argument, because no one can debate it. If someone were to debate it, like, no, it's not. No, it's definitely not in Paris, France. It would be a very trivial and frankly easy matter to disprove that claim. Okay, so facts are not arguments. Matters of belief or values that we have are not arguments, right? If I believe in a God, or if I believe in Santa Claus, or if I believe that I am 500 feet tall, no one can disprove me, right? No one can walk up to me and say, no, you do not believe that. Well, that's my belief. I can believe whatever I want. Whether my belief is actually true in real life, that's another matter entirely. But for someone to come up to me and say, I don't believe something, well, that can't be argued. So if you say something, I believe blank, or I think that blank, that is not an argument. And that's the danger here, right? That phrase is so important, right? If I say, I believe that the United States should address immigration laws a specific way, for instance, that's not a thesis. But if I drop the I believe that, and I just say, the United States should address immigration laws this specific way, now it is an argument, right? And that there's a key difference there, right? One is belief, one is a statement that I'm attempting to prove, and will have to prove with some supporting evidence and some logic and reasoning, right? The last thing that cannot be an argument is a matter of opinion or a matter of preference. And be careful with the word opinion here, right? Practically anything that might be an opinion could also be an argument. But when I use the word opinion here, I mean preference, right? So if I say something like, I like brownies more than I like cake. Well, that's a matter of opinion or preference, right? No one can tell me, like, no, you don't. Again, it's very similar to the belief idea, right? Well, my taste buds sense that I do like this more than this other thing, so you can't argue with that. You can't prove that I don't like it one way or the other. So matters of preference or opinion. Another example is like whether or not you find someone attractive, right? Like, well, I think so-and-so is attractive. Like, no, you don't. Like, again, you can't argue that. If someone told you, no, you don't find this person attractive, who's to say you don't? No one can argue against that. That is a matter of opinion or preference. So keep this in mind. If we take a look at, these thesis statements, for instance, we can probably rule some of these out for very different reasons, right? If I say Moby Dick is about the problem of evil, well, certainly it is somewhat of a thesis, right? There is some argument there. Someone could argue about that, but it's too vague. It's too general. Practically anything can be about the problem of evil, not just the novel Moby Dick. So how are we supposed to, argue that? So that's too vague. Moby Dick is boring and pointless. First of all, no, it's not. It's an amazing piece of literature, but it requires a lot of appreciation. But more importantly here in this context, it's also a matter of preference, right? If I think it's boring and pointless, that doesn't mean it's true for everyone, right? Some other people will think it's not boring. It's actually very interesting and has a purpose. So that's a matter of opinion or preference, therefore not an argument, right? And lastly here, Moby Dick is about a big white whale. Well, that's a fact. That is true. That is what the novel is about. I mean, in very small terms, actually, it's about the whaling industry as a whole and the way certain literary texts of different genres are being melded together. But again, the point here is that this is still just a fact, and it cannot be argued. Okay, so none of these three would be acceptable as a thesis. Now, if we take a look at this last one, it says the use of whiteness in Moby Dick illustrates the uncertainty of the meaning of life that Ishmael expresses throughout the novel. Okay, now that's a mouthful, but that should also be a clue. Most theses are much longer sentences than a traditional, standard declarative sentence. A thesis can also be qualified, meaning if you can use subordinating clauses like starting with if or when or since, right? If X, then Y, right? That would be a formula for a good thesis, right? If the United States decides to declare war on North Korea, then we will be threatened with nuclear war at home. Okay. Again, that's an argument. I didn't say I believe or I think that. It's certainly not a fact, and it's not a matter of opinion or preference. I could definitely debate with someone about the merits of that claim. Okay. The key here is that you could qualify your statement. You can make it more specific. The more specific, the better. But only make it specific if you're confident that you can have enough supporting evidence to prove that. Okay. So that's the first key. The first key is thesis, and it is so important. Okay. The next thing we want to look at is to make sure that we have careful attention to the language of the text that we're analyzing, right? We need to be able to look at a text's meaning, but the only way to do that is if we have a good understanding of what the text says, which is why it's so important to reread the text that you're analyzing. You'll also want to pay attention to patterns or themes, and we've been having a lot of practice with this. The past couple of discussion boards, as well as the ones coming up this week, are all exercises in determining themes or patterns that exist in the text. And lastly, you need to make sure that you have some sort of clear interpretation, and this will be very similar to your thesis, right? The thesis is an argument usually about the devices that you recognize. At least in this class, we're going to be focusing on literary devices, right? But the interpretation is the theme, the meaning as a whole, right? After you write your literary analysis, you want to show your readers that there is one way that the text could be understood or that could be read, and that would be your interpretation, right? In the lottery, for instance, I think most of us said, well, clearly this is about how we are so stuck in our ways and we refuse to change, and how tradition can be damaging or harmful. I think most of us agreed, but the key is, well, how did we come up with that answer, right? And if you saw the lecture on my analysis of the lottery, you can see that I came up with that answer by looking at the plot, the characters, the setting, the style, the juxtaposition, which is a literary device, the symbolism, which is another literary device, right? We looked at several elements of the text in order to arrive at that answer. Okay, now a couple of other things we should consider, right? Keep in mind what your purpose is, right? Keep in mind who your audience is. What stance are you taking? Not so much media and design. We're all going to use the same media and design, which is a paper, an essay. Okay. When you put the text together, you want to figure out how you want to analyze it. And I can tell you right now, there's really only one way we're going to analyze it, and that's A. The other two, B and C, are only for, again, upper level literature courses. For this class, we're going to be looking at just the basic analysis, which is looking at the text itself. We're looking at themes, characters, language. We want to figure out how the meaning is achieved, either by tone or effect of what of the text that the author is trying to use. And again, we would use literary terms, describe characters and settings, and look at certain key scenes to develop our arguments, right? So this is really what we're going to be looking at. We want to find evidence to support our interpretation, and we want to cite and document sources appropriately. So if you want to look at a really basic way of organizing your analysis, and this is really what I'll be expecting from most of you. First, you'll need an introduction that obviously introduces the text that you're analyzing and where your thesis is written. Okay, so if I was going to do the lottery, for instance, I might say Shirley Jackson's The Lottery is a short story about tradition, right? I'm already hinting to readers about what I think my interpretation is the moment I write that first sentence. I might give a little bit more background by saying that Shirley Jackson wrote it in the 1940s, that she was a woman who was a feminist and who was writing this story in an attempt to do X, Y, or Z, and then finally I come up with my thesis, right? I know, or this short story is a commentary on tradition and the harm it can do, based on the literary devices such as juxtaposition, symbolism, and character development in the story, right? And that could be my thesis, and I'd be set, right? So that should be in your first paragraph, or at least the first block of text. The next thing we want to look at is, try to cite passages from the text one by one, explaining how each one supports your thesis and interpretation. So what I might do is, pay attention to a certain scene, right? A lot of you looked at the scene where the men are nervous and they're, joking around the pile or near the pile of stones, and they are smiling rather than laughing, suggesting that they're really nervous about what's happening, right? And that tension is being built. Well, I could, introduce that scene, and if I want to mention, look at the juxtaposition here, then I can quote from the text to show, hey, look at the specific, wording that the author is using, and it clearly reveals, that something's about to happen. It reveals this idea of blank, or of X, Y, and Z, and so on, right? And you do that over and over again. You do that as many times you need until you get to your point. Okay. Finally, you should try to sum up your interpretation in light of your analysis, right? Now that we've gone through these key scenes, or these key devices, or these key elements, and that I've supported them with my own logic and reasoning explanation, this is what the conclusion I can arrive at. And finally, of course, you need to document your sources using MLA citation. It's pretty basic. Okay. Now, the only way you can really analyze literature is if you understand, what elements you think are more important. And sometimes those elements are difficult to understand. But part of it is understanding, key ideas. We talked about characters, and we haven't talked about the different kind of characters, but I did leave this here for you to look at. Understanding what connotation and denotation mean, looking at figurative language, how a sentence is read, and what that means in the bigger context of the story, looking at imagery, looking at plot, and we did do a lot of this. I spent a lot of time last week on plot. Point of view, I did spend a little bit of time on there, and there's more explanation here, looking at setting and looking at symbolism. Okay. Now, I strongly recommend that you go through the rest of this document. I went through the first half with you, but I think you'd be best served going through the rest of the document on your own so that you can get a better idea of what to look for. Okay. Now, lastly, I do want to draw your attention again to the literary terms glossary. You can find this in the week 2 folder, along with some a handout on the elements of a story, as well as how to identify a theme. But this gives you some really helpful vocabulary that you can use and some key ideas that we've talked about. A lot of this stuff is related to only one specific thing. For instance, this refers only to plays, films, maybe some stories, although I wouldn't consider comedy, tragedy, and tragicomedy as parts of a story. But if you go further down, here are the things that you should find in a story, like a theme, a setting, a plot. Within the plot, we'll find an exposition, the initiating or inciting incident, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution, the denouement, and we might even find conflict. What kind of conflicts we might find, the point of view, the kinds of characters we'll see, even more specifically, what a rounded or flat or dynamic or static character looks like, what a foil or confidant is, and so on. And you can go through these ideas. But the big one that I think is really important are these literary devices. And that's what I want to cover a little bit more in depth for the remainder of this lecture. So one thing we haven't had a chance to talk about is symbolism. In the broadest sense, a symbol is something that stands for something else. For instance, a rose is used to symbolize love. Another example, if I say, well, we're going to bow down to the crown, or we're going to obey the crown. Well, I don't literally mean we're going to be worshiping or pledging allegiance to a crown, just a piece of jewelry. I mean that the crown is a symbol for the king or nobility, right? And we have all these kinds of things. In literature, there are some conventional symbols. Sometimes we'll use rose to mean love, or we'll use white to mean purity, or black represents death or evil. And you can probably guess at some of the racism inherently there. We can use the color red to mean love, but it can also mean lust or it can mean sin. It just depends on how red is being used. Now, some, of course, are easier to detect and decipher than others, but in modern literature, writers use symbols in a less conventional way, and they try to create symbolic connections that are more suitable to today's world, right? For instance, we might say, we might use text messaging, for instance. Anytime, a character is about to do something dramatic, and it's all undone with a simple text, right? He has this elaborate lie, and suddenly an old text he sent that uncovers his lie shows up, right? We use text messaging as a symbol for an invasion of privacy or a social weakness that exists, right? And suddenly becomes a symbol for more things, and then more authors can use that symbol again and again to show that, or to represent that idea. Of course, other writers use conventional symbols, but they can use it in unexpected or even completely opposite ways, right? Sometimes a rose isn't love, as we said earlier. Sometimes it can mean death, right? The way we can lay roses, for instance, on a casket. So suddenly rose it can mean love, but it simultaneously means death. Or the way in Beauty and the Beast, right? Rose represents love in the sense that, it represents the hope for love or the need for love. But the fact that it's dying also represents death itself, right? And it's difficult, right? Not all literature is going to use direct symbolism, but you're going to have to be the one to figure out what that is a symbol for. I, for example, use the symbol of the black box from the lottery, right? It's a black box, meaning it's the unknown. It's dark. It's hard to see through. But because of the box, the wooden aspect, the fact that it's old, it represents something that's evil, but also a tradition. And so therefore that evil tradition concept becomes more obvious, right, as we go on. So you'll have to, again, figure out whether that's a symbol or not. The problem is you don't want to fall into the trap of trying to apply really deep symbolism to everything you read, right? Sometimes it's not a symbol. Sometimes it's just, the object is the object, right? A rose is just a rose. But you have to determine whether that's the case or not. And a good way to determine that is if you understand or you have an interpretation of the story, go back and read the story and see, well, what parts of the story are contributing to that interpretation, to that meaning. And if you see items or objects that help with that meaning, well, then those might be symbols. Okay. We have metaphors. Now, metaphors are a direct comparison linking two unlike items to make a usually symbolic point, right? For instance, the wolf is at the door is a metaphor from the Middle Ages that means death from hunger or starvation is afflicting a particular family or a house, right? So the wolf was essentially, this ravenous creature that was desired food, and was therefore hungry all the time. And if it's at your door, there's not literally a wolf at your door. It means that the wolf represents starvation and that your family is the one being afflicted by it. When you say the sky is a blanket of stars, again, you're using a metaphor. We use metaphors quite frequently in our everyday language, and most people never realize it, right? The problem is, how do you recognize that those are metaphors? We have allegories here, although that one, we haven't had an opportunity to look at any allegories, so I'm going to skip that one for now. We have similes, and again, this one's similar to a metaphor, but it uses like or as. So she is as busy as a bee. It felt like an oven in my car, and so on. We have personification. Now, this is when we give human characteristics as something that's not. And we do this all the time, right? The weather is really mean today, for instance. Well, the weather can't be mean. It doesn't have emotions, but we tend to tie human characteristics, right? Emotions to things that are completely inanimate, that things are not human, right? We talk about, for instance, Lady Liberty, right? We consider freedom, in this case, to be a woman, even though, of course, liberty is this abstract concept. It has no gender, but we give it. Same thing with Mother Nature or Uncle Sam, right? We do this to personify these ideas so that, rather than remaining abstract, they become more concrete, they become more real. We have allusions, and usually an allusion is a reference to something that really happened outside of the text, right? Sometimes it references a literary or historical person, place, or event, or some other literary work or passage. For instance, if someone were to write about Bill Gates, the Microsoft genius and creator, the public's wish for a simpler way to use their personal computers was Bill Gates' burning bush. Most people should make the connection that the voice of the public was like the voice of God for Moses, directing Bill to be free and the people from the bondage of complicated computer code, right? This burning bush idea, for example, if you're familiar with the biblical passage, that Moses spoke to a burning bush and the burning bush was the voice of God, right? So, sometimes we'll use references from other literary works, in this case, a religious text, to make our point that much clearer. Okay. Sometimes you'll find onomatopoeias, right? These are sound words like crash or clang or bzz or things like that. These are onomatopoeic. We have oxymorons, which are two completely contrasting things that are put right together. Silent, scream, hot, ice, cold, fire. Acting, which is to pretend, right? Naturally. Seriously joking, and plastic glasses. One of my personal favorites, jumbo shrimp, right? Shrimp are usually small. To make them jumbo seems strange and oxymoronic. We have hyperbole, which is anytime we exaggerate or have stuff, right? He's as big as a house, or I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, right? These are completely, of course, crazy, exaggerations, but we use them nonetheless to make a point. Sometimes you have a euphemism. This is when you say something nice instead of saying the less polite or rude thing, right? Sometimes we'll say things like, I'm not a janitor, I'm a custodian, right? So custodian seems, nicer to say than rather than saying you're a janitor, right? Or here, for example, you can say he kicked the bucket, right? We know that means for saying that he died, right? Or sometimes we'll say oh fudge or oh sugar or sugar honey iced tea to avoid using the obscenity instead of the in saving face, essentially. Okay. Sometimes we'll use satire, which means we're making fun of something that's actually kind of serious, and usually we do this to expose something, right? One of my favorite ones is Jonathan Swift's. Here I'm mentioning Gulliver's Travels, but my other favorite one is the solution to poverty. Solution to world poverty. Essentially, where he suggested that we should eat babies, right? That'll solve hunger. Solution to world hunger, not solution to poverty. Solution to world hunger. He talked about eating babies, right? He says they grow great with salt. He needs a little bit of pepper. We can make them as much as we want, right? It's an easy food source, right? It was complete satire, but he was talking about it to address the potato famine in Ireland. And then finally, we have parodies, right? These are creative works or performances where we're closely imitating something for comic effect or in ridicule. You'll see this, of course, a lot on SNL, where they make fun of real people, but they usually do it to expose, again, something else. Scary Movie does this pretty well. They make fun of other scary movies and focus on the tropes, the frequent ideas or themes that come up in scary movies that seem silly, right? And I think that's all for short story. You can keep going through to see poetry, a few more things that are specific to plays and so on. There's actually quite a lot on plays. But you should try to get familiar with this list so that way you're not lost and can speak intelligently when you're writing about literature. Okay, that is all I wanted to cover in this discussion. Keep in mind that besides the rough draft and besides the final draft that are due this week, you also have the week 4 discussion on A Good Man is Hard to Find. Again, so just to reiterate, the rough draft is due on Wednesday, and again, that is not required. Okay, in fact, it won't hurt my feelings if you don't do it. That's less for me to grade, frankly, and give feedback to. But if you don't turn in a rough draft, you will be at a significant disadvantage compared to those who do turn one in. This will be essentially your only chance to get feedback from me for this assignment. Of course, if you don't want to turn in a rough draft, you can still get feedback from the Writing Center and get an idea. You can still email me with any questions you might have about the assignment. But I insist that you go over the documents I've left you. Obviously, several documents that you can access to understand a little bit more about the assignment. But again, my best suggestion is to complete the rough draft. And I will try to get feedback in time so that way you can complete the assignment for Sunday. So again, the plan is for Wednesday, submit the rough draft. I'll try to have everything back by Thursday night, so that way you have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If I don't get it back to Thursday, I'll get it back to you definitely Friday, and that still gives you at least 2 days to make changes as you need. Okay. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I still do have online office hours available, so you can email me to set up an appointment, and we can discuss this through video chat or just regular IMing, if whatever's easier for you. Okay, thank you.